Creston's put together here on climate change. I first want to thank you, Creston, for your vision in doing this. I think it's really important, and I think it's important just to sort of kickstart by saying that all of us have different kinds of strengths and skill sets that we can bring to bear collectively to deal with this issue. I don't think it's purely a scientific problem, purely an economic problem, purely a cultural problem. I think it really requires all of us putting our skills together in whatever field that we are working in or specializing in, because it really is a wicked problem. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is, what constitutes an environmental politics in the age of climate change? How does that environment, or how might that environmental politics work? So without sort of getting into all the details of climate change, because I think with this audience here, I might just sort of assume that we're all on the same page there. With other audiences, I have to spend quite a bit of time laying out the IPCC report and the recent findings and updates on where we currently stand vis-a-vis warming in the world. I will just say very, very quickly that the rate of warming, whilst the Earth has warmed 0.87 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit since the Industrial Revolution, I think one important factor that we need to keep in mind as we try to keep global warming within the 1.5 degrees Celsius range, which according to the recent climate talks, we're really not going to be on track for that at all, is also the other wicked problem that has to do with land use warming, right? So land warming, which, just to sort of quickly bring this into relief, our land warms at twice the rate of the general global warming. So when we talk about global warming, land warming is occurring at double that rate. So for example, at the moment, we've got a situation where the Earth's land has warmed already 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is going to cause significant problems moving forward, some of which we're already seeing with the terrible fires that occurred in Australia, my home country. I'm now living in the US, but I mean, they were just devastating. And the fires that have been happening throughout California, other parts of the world. And then you have other sorts of issues to do with, flooding and so on and so forth, that's certainly interrupting agricultural production, deforestation that's happening throughout the Amazon. So that's the situation with the land. And then meanwhile, with our oceans, some of the impacts of global warming are already being experienced there at a dramatic rate. We've got all these dead zones that are appearing throughout our oceans. So for example, since 1950 up until today, those dead zones have increased tenfold, from 50 to approximately 500, say the scientists. So the dead zones in the ocean are a result of not just global climate change and the warming of the oceans, but human beings using the oceans as a dumping ground. So, we've got some pretty wicked problems that we're having to deal with moving forward. And I just wanted to start by outlining how I understand the nature of that problem. So I think the first thing that we need to think about as we try to grapple with the scale of this issue is that, global environmental issues are not just restricted to climate change. They're also to do with, land use patterns, pollution, and, legislation, the inability to kind of continue to provide regulatory mechanisms for a variety of reasons. So I think we need to start first and foremostly by recognizing that we need to understand the historical conditions that have led to this current situation. And I'm going to divide those historical conditions up into 4 primary issues. The first being environmental degradation, the second being inequity, the third being corporate governance, and the fourth being militarism. And then from there, talk about the social institutions that reinforce those historical conditions. And then out of that, start to grapple with the question of what kind of politics might work in the face of that wicked problem. So to start with the first one, if we're looking at environmental degradation, I just outlined some of the issues to do with, the situation of our oceans, the situation of land use patterns. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out, the other wicked problem to do with greenhouse gas emissions, which, as we know, the safe level is 350 parts per million. We've exceeded that. We're now at 410 parts per million many times during the year, and generally speaking at 400 parts per million, and it just keeps on going up. We've got a species rate extinction that's occurring between 1,000 to 10,000 against the background rate. And then if you look at sort of the cumulative effects of what happens with, say, for example, our land use patterns, as in the case in Australia, where, over 1 billion animals have now disappeared just as the result of one summer period of intense fires. At one point, my country, had fires all along the East Coast, and they had jumped over into the West Coast. I've got family members sharing photos with me of completely scorched national forest areas. So, these kinds of problems all begin to kind of create a circular effect where they begin to reinforce one another. But it's not just at the level of environmental degradation. We have this other wicked problem of inequity currently in the world, and this is a result of the way in which our economic system works. The 2007 Stern report said that the overall costs and risks of climate change are equivalent to losing 5% of GDP a year. So there are severe economic consequences to us not addressing the climate problem. But in addition to that, we've got, as Oxfam reported in 2016, 82% of the wealth of the world is in the hands of 1% of the population. So I just want to reinforce that statistic. 82% of the world's wealth sits in the hands of 1% of the population. 3.7 billion people in the world have experienced no wealth growth. So I spend quite a lot of time in my role as a UNESCO chair with some of the most disadvantaged communities around the world. I spent 3 to 4 years in and out of the slums of Nairobi, documenting the situation that people there are encountering. But I've also spent the last 3 years in and out of Native American communities across the United States, looking at the impact that sea level rise is having on many of those communities whose homes are literally falling into the oceans. And then time with LaDonna up at Standing Rock. She was one of it was her land that the Sacred Stone Camp was placed on during all the protests against the Keystone Pipeline, learning from her about not just the fact that the pipeline was displacing, which was terrible in and of itself, Native American burial sites, but it's already leaking, and that is their primary water source. So these are just some examples of the way inequity is working in the world today. And then we have the next problem, and this is connected to inequity and environmental degradation. It's what I'm calling neoliberal governance. And that occurs when the corporate sector carries an undue influence over the decisions that are being made by those holding public office. And I think the best way to probably describe that situation is through a few statistics. So the subsidies at the moment to the fossil fuel industry in the United States amount to approximately $20 billion a year. And in Europe, they amount to 55 billion euros a year. So the fossil fuel industry is one of the most powerful lobbying sectors, and it's certainly one of the most powerful when it comes to trying to stop meaningful action on climate change. It spent $2 billion lobbying the US government between 2000 and 2016 in an effort to halt meaningful action on climate change. So this then leads me to the third historical condition, and that's militarism. So when we look at all of those issues, and then we begin to think about, well, how does this connect to other forms of violence that are happening around the world? Now, in 2018, the Global Witness, it's sort of like a human rights watch group, they reported that there were 164 killings of land and environmental defenders. So 164 people were killed in 2018 for trying to defend the land and environmental issues. And then there were countless more, thousands, they say, that were silenced because of attacks, because of arrests, because of death threats and lawsuits. And if we sort of look at the way these kinds of issues then infiltrate our systems of governance, we could just briefly look at the United States. And I think this is very, very common knowledge. It's been talked about before that, you know, the previous Vice President of the United States, Dick Cheney, also used to be the Chief Executive of Halliburton from 1995 to 2000. Halliburton went on to earn $39.5 billion in federal contracts for the Iraq War. Right? In 2015, the Global Peace Index said that the impact of conflict on the global economy was $13.6 trillion. And currently there are only 10 countries that the Global Peace Index reports as being entirely free of conflict. And when it talks about conflict, it's meaning conflict that's both inside and external to national borders. So what do we do with all of this? We need to sort of think about the ways in which these four dominant historical conditions coalesce into what I've described elsewhere as a fascist earth. Now, a fascist earth, in the way that I'm using it here, is very much leaning on Deleuze and Guattari and Brian Masumi's use of the term. And it's basically a way of life that's engaged in absolute destruction. So it's an earth that is dominated by social institutions that despotically overcode all facets of life. And it does this by placing life in the service of capital accumulation and the four historical conditions that I've just described. So we need to begin to think about, well, how does that overcoding work? And one way in which we philosophically can pry apart that problem is to look at how the social institutions in question are reinforcing these historical conditions. So we could start with, for example, the first one being the socio-economic institution that uses free markets to solve environmental degradation. But so far, the free market economy has been the very instrument that has led to this problem in the first place. I've argued numerous times in my trilogy that Creston referred to, that really, I think it's a misplaced political gesture to try to use the self-same mechanisms that have led to this problem to solve the problem in the first place. We need to be able to have the courage to imagine a life outside of that economic system, something that's different to that. And we need to understand the ways in which inequity and economic factors, militarism and governance all intersect into this very, very sort of powerful mechanism. So this leaves the problem of economic growth, if we just look to sort of the idea of the free market solving it, it leaves the problem of economic growth, which is usually pitched at around about 3% per year. It leaves that intact, right? So this is not really presenting any kind of limit to capital in any meaningful way. Then this brings us to the next social institution, that being the political. So governments could use their power to distribute wealth, to reinvest in the future as an opportunity for creating an inclusive and fair society, and to try to protect biodiversity. This is why I'm deeply in favour of Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal, because what it actually does is connect, you know, economic issues of inequity to issues around environmental degradation. And then this leads us to the next social institution, and that being the social, right? And what we have currently is a situation where, for example, as mentioned before, environmental activists are recoded as eco-terrorists, and that then means that dissent is suppressed as it's criminalized. So this law mechanism of repression can be seen, for example, in the US Department of Homeland Security recently claiming that climate activists, for example, like the Climate Direct action group that does non-violent civil disobedience actions, it's labelled them as extremists. In the United Kingdom, Greenpeace has now been listed amongst neo-Nazis on their counter-terrorism list. So you can see where I'm going with all of this. The next social institution is our cultural institutions. So in hijacking sustainability, I really pried this apart, and I looked at the ways in which green branding works as a problem of individualism, right? So this idea that we can, you know, anxiously recycle more, we can buy green, and that's somehow going to get us out of this problem. It's not to say that we don't do those things, but in doing those things, sometimes it's a displacement activity, and it means that we don't look at some of these other deeper structural problems that we really need to start to address. And then on a more sort of insidious level, in my more recent book out of the trilogy, so the trilogy I'm referring to is the first one being Hijacking Sustainability with MIT Press, the second one being The Wrath of Capital, which came out with Columbia University Press, and then the third one, which recently came out to sort of finish it off, was Birth of a New Earth. And in there, I looked at sort of the role that imagination can play. But imagination in and of itself is not liberatory, I argued. It's the ways in which it's put to work, right? You can have really fascistic forms of imagination. If we just look at the way in which, you know, right-wing groups, neo-Nazi groups, and nativist kinds of organizations around the world are really coming to the fore. They're putting the imagination to work, but they're doing so in a very, very exclusive and reactionary kind of way. So I argue that in many ways, you know, much like my dear friend Santiago Zabala, who brought out a gorgeous book on how art can save us, is, you know, how do we kind of put the affective power of imagination to work in a liberatory way and not in what I called in Birth of a New Earth, an apocalyptic way, right? So here we're sort of now coming to, you know, this question of, well, how might a transformative politics work? And more recently, I've been starting to think about this as, you know, Deleuze talked about, you know, Deleuze and Guattari, desiring production and social production, and he talked about their connection. And I'm sort of trying to think about, well, what might, you know, the trans-productive force be? Because if we can recognize, you know, for them, they talk about desire as social, right? So it's pre-individual. This is not a sort of psychoanalytic understanding of desire as housed within an individual subject, but desire for them is something that's social. It's the way in which it connects, you know, matter and energy, right? And then you have social institutions that organize the sort of chaotic, disruptive aspects of desire. So basically what I've sort of outlined here is a version of that model. But what that leaves intact is it's all fine and well to say, well, desire can also be liberatory, right? Because it is disruptive and it is chaotic. But the question is, how do you put it to work, right? To produce a transformative politics. And this is where I'm starting to think about, well, what might the transproductive force be, okay? So let's take another little step back and think about the way in which politics at the moment generally works. So you've either got your vertical layer or your horizontal layer. So if we start with the sort of horizontal layer, this notion of radicality as functioning on the outside of what's going on normatively as a way to produce change, you could look to theorists who I deeply admire, like David Harvey, for example, who talks about, you know, that all political change must occur from outside the system of capital, right? So he describes himself as resolutely anti-capitalist, and that's the only way to be revolutionary. Or we could look to Michael Hart and Antonio Negri with their concept of the multitude. So very careful not to conflate the idea of the multitude with, say, for example, Kennedy's notion of generalized populism of the crowd. But it's this idea of many peoples and its decentralized network of social relations that produce change, right? Or you could go more into the vertical realm and say, okay, well, you've got to operate within the structures that we already have. And that's the sort of reformist line, right? So someone like Thomas Piketty would be arguing that, because he's saying we've got to introduce a global wealth tax in order to redistribute wealth. I think my dear friend Nancy Fraser could probably be placed in that camp as well, taking a feminist perspective, but she also argues for the redistribution of wealth and recognising cultural differences, but she's very much sort of as a result of sort of her learning with Habermas many years ago when she was doing her PhD, this idea of re-invoking the public sphere and representative forms of democracy. But my question there is, and I think this is where we're at the moment, if we look at the sort of right-wing turn that happened in Spain recently, the right-wing turn that's happened in Germany, in places that had really robust leftist political spheres, what happens if the radicals, you know, the multitude, democratic governance, and the participatory sphere of, say, Habermas, what happens if all of these start to desire their own oppression? And that's what we're getting at the moment, right? And I think this is a fundamental problem that we need to start to philosophically interrogate, because Wilhelm Reich pointed this out in the mass psychology of fascism many, many years ago, right? What happens if the masses desire their own oppression? I think the Trump election has been instructive of this. You know, 63 million people voted for him, right? And he voted on the platform of being a climate denier. And yet when I looked at the voters and where their positions stand vis-a-vis climate change, what's really interesting is that 49% of those voters trust climate change. 52% of them actually support eliminating federal subsidies to fossil fuel industries. 62% of them support government regulation on pollution, and 77% of them support green energy. I think that really brings this problem of desiring your own repression into stark relief. So I think one of the greatest hurdles that environmental politics faces is the manner in which social change is affirmed. It's got to skirt co-optation. It's got to strategically move between the horizontal and the vertical layer. It's got to be like an inside-out Mobius strip operation. And it's not just a problem of working at different spatial scales, right? It's not just this problem of the local, the regional, the national, and the international. And this is where I start to think about the imagination again. How can we put the imagination to work in a way that's liberatory, that's emancipatory, that's inclusive? And I think this is where, you know, cultural production certainly has a role to play. I think this is where the strategies of political activists have a role to play. Greta Thunberg, you know, I can't believe, like a child, a teenager now, is doing exactly this. She's working on the outside. There's the strike on Friday from school. There's the mass rallies. There's the sort of activist gesture of sailing across the ocean and not flying. But then she's also working inside the system. She's going to the United Nations. You can't get a more institutionalized political modality than going there. She's advised the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom Prime Minister turned around and declared that we have a climate emergency because in response to Greta Thunberg. So I think Thunberg's actually fascinating in that regard because she's both reformist and revolutionary. And that's something that, you know, is not easily appropriated. That's why, you know, the Trumps of this world find her so threatening. They can't appropriate her. And I think if we couch our politics purely within one axis, the vertical or the horizontal, we're vulnerable to appropriation, which is what I was sort of talking about with, you know, environmental activists now being illegalized, being killed, being declared as terrorists, and so on and so forth. So in conclusion, I'd like to say that the problem of political stasis is a problem of alignment. To date, historical conditions and social institutions have connected to a sort of neoliberal fascistic Weltanschauung that directs the movement and content of both using the principles of the market. We've got to remember Marx's statement that capital is a process. It's not a thing. And the way in which it works is by appropriating the limits that are presented to capital and placing them back in the service of further capital accumulation. So we must refuse being reduced to a state of bearing witness, which is something that I brought up in a recent New York Times interview. We've got to avoid that state of bearing witness, one that leaves us observing in awe and terror the quiet disappearance of countless species, the wildfires that are scorching life into somber piles of charcoal and ash, drowning of coastal cities, the lonely migration, both human and non-human, as habitats are decimated by deforestation, drought, and war. I think this is going to have to engage with bastard solidarities, and that's a politics that's premised upon promiscuity, one that takes appropriation and co-optation as its political object. And that's why I would call it a transproductive political undertaking. So hopefully that's the beginning for some interesting conversations.